Yeah, there's some really good stuff here. So Luis said state is data on the class component. So there's two things there. State is data, and you have to have a class component to be able to have state. Both of these are true. Mitchell said current data that the component is using, which kind of indicates like this time sensitive, it can change, but state represents the current data, and I agree. Christopher said it's an object containing properties that indicate the status of a component. Yeah, so state is an object that we can work with. It allows some dynamic things. And Stefan has this really interesting thing that talks about carrying data to parts of the component. And I'll even add state you can push off into other people's components. And then finally, state is mutable. So I think you have a pretty good idea of all these things that envelop state. It's mutable, it's an object, you have to have a class component, it can change over time. All these ideas are good. You should have those ideas when somebody says state. How can we change state? Yeah, set state. And it's a method that we get when we extend React.component. So why do we have to use set state instead of just like changing state? For example, let me pull up a little text window here. If we have this .state.name, why can't I just change it like this? James says React is picky, and I think that sums up a lot of the things that are kind of annoying with React. It's like, it's picky. That's just the way it is. You have to use set state, and that's because if you don't, React won't know that the change happened. It won't know to re-render. It won't care. So you have to, I'm going to label this and say bad. And I'll label this and say good. You have to do something like this, .set state, give it a new object. You can give it a partial version of state, and then you can give it the new stuff. You can make that bigger. Venki's asking about something called previous state, which I think some of you might have seen through all of your Googling and research trying to get last night's project figured out. We are covering previous state today, but not quite yet. So there's a few more kind of just verbal things I want to get through. Components that don't have this .state in them are considered stateless. So let me first off, we can write a functional component called foo. You know it's a functional component because it's a function. And it says, hi. This is stateless. There is no state anywhere. I'll write another one that takes in props, and let's say it displays hi props.name. That is also stateless. But what if I instead had class foo extends react.component? I have a render function, and I'm going to return a div that says hi. Is this one, this latest one I just wrote, is this stateless? Yep. Agree. Even though class.foo, or this foo here, this last one, even though it has the potential to have state, I haven't used state. I'm not making use of it. There's nothing that can change in this component over time on its own. So it is also considered stateless. The only time that a component is not stateless is if you have, I'll put a comment, this is stateful, is one word that people can use to describe it. So if I have something like this, again, a render function, I'll just copy this one down. Except this time I'll do hi this.state.name. And then as chat reminded us, we actually have to have a constructor. It needs to call super. And then we need to do this .state or this .state equals an object with a name. So stateless can come in a lot of different ways. Stateful only happens when you have some form of this .state. When, I think we kind of already hit this, but I just want to have a sentence that says it. When you call set state, React will eventually re-render your component with the updated state. Okay, now I want to dive into controlled and uncontrolled components. I dropped a link in chat at it was pretty late last night because I realized that the project requires use of controlled components, but we didn't cover them in class. So today, right now, we're going to talk about uncontrolled components versus controlled components. First off, what we've already been doing and what we did all of is uncontrolled components. So let me talk through what we have in this code window right now. We have class app. It extends React component. And then in addition, we have here on line 8, this .state equals some object. So this is a stateful. We have a handle change function, which takes an event and sets the state to this target value. So you'd be thinking, oh, okay, it's this is probably happens in response to an input. And sure enough, on line 24, we see that this input on change calls this event handler. So if I come over here to what does this actually do, and I type ASDF, then we can see that this .state.uncontrolled text is being printed because of these 3 lines, which take the event, extract the value, and reset the state. So I think most of you were able to figure that out and get a good sense of how to make that work. But then we ran into a problem. What do we do when we want to add a button that clears the input? So let's add a button and let's try and figure that out right now. I'm going to add a button. It'll have a click handler. I'll say click to clear. I'm going to call the click handler this .handle click, and I'll add it up here. So what do I do? Well, I could try to do this .set state and set uncontrolled text to an empty string. Let's see if that works. Click to clear, seems to do what I want right now. If I type ASDF, and then I click to clear, this up here cleared out, but our text down here is still there. And now if I type like another F, all of a sudden this event happened, and then this set state ran again, and now we're back to like ASDFFF. But if I click to clear, this one clears, but this one doesn't, and this was probably a source of frustration for a lot of people last night. This is where controlled components come in handy. David was helpful, and he actually posted the docs to controlled components. So I'm gonna open those up. And you can read through this. I think React's documentation is actually quite good. So you can read through this. I'm going to jump to the really important part. We can take an input. Is this text big enough? Okay, that is 3 yeses. Sweet. We can take an input of type text. By the way, type text is default, so that's why I've usually been omitting it. And we can control the value that it displays. That right there is what makes it a controlled component. When we dictate to the input what value it should show, it is a controlled component. We are controlling what it shows. So let's jump back to our code. Let's experiment with this a little bit. I'm going to say that the input value is going to be the constant string that says Russell. Let's see what happens. Okay. You'll see the input field already has Russell in it. I'm going to type. Hopefully you can hear my keyboard and believe me that I'm typing. You'll notice that the input is never changing. Like this down here is not changing at all. And that's because we're saying always show Russell. Your value is Russell. But then you'll also notice that this .setState, this handle change, is being called. And it's doing kind of a weird thing where it's only able to catch one letter. And it's trying to set the state. In fact, it is setting the state of uncontrolled text. It's just like, it doesn't get very far because it can only ever get one letter at a time. So super weird. And you almost would never want to control an input with a static value like that. But if we change it to this .state uncontrolled text, save that. Now if we type ASDF, we're back to working. Great. Backspace works still. Click to clear. Now it works for both of them. So let me try that again. I can type things. I can backspace and it gets updated. And then I can click to clear, which changes uncontrolled text, which changes both value and what's displayed. So now that we've made this change, this is a really bad name for the state variable. So I'm going to go back through and rename it to controlled text. Controlled text. Say my controlled text is. Okay, I think that'll do it. And clear still works. So now it has a better name. Does the idea of controlled components make sense? Is there anything you want me to answer about this? Oh, I'm seeing what people are saying in chat. For example, Jennifer used a query selector to clear the input. And I'm actually really glad that I didn't show you controlled components because you hit this issue, you figured out a way around it, and you thought to yourself, wow, React is pretty stupid if this is the best it can do. But now you know how to do it better, and you will never forget how to do it because this is very clearly a better solution. Yeah, Benke said that probably up in this handle change that you could do event.target.value equals empty string. And that's because event.target is literally this DOM element. And then the value is like the text inside of it. So it's a way to both extract the value and interact with it. So I'm really glad you all got the pleasure of struggling with that. And I'm also really glad that now we've been able to show this to you. I'm going to paste to you a code sandbox. So open that up. It might look really familiar because it is basically redoing what I just showed to you. We are going to hit this home and make sure that everybody understands controlled versus uncontrolled, when to use each. So what I want you to do is come in here, and instead of what I did where I replaced my uncontrolled property with renaming it to controlled, I want you to just make a second input box and a second, and a button that corresponds to it. Do the same thing with a click handler to set it to empty string, and then set everything up so that you have a controlled component and an uncontrolled component in the same file. I will put this code that we just wrote together up. So work through that, and we'll come back in, well, I think 5 minutes is kind of my default. Let's start with 5 minutes, and if that's enough, do that. If not, we will address it and see if we need more time. But work through the code pen or the code sandbox that I just pasted, and we'll be back in 4 minutes and 50 seconds. Okay. Does everyone feel like they had enough time to explore that and do as much of it as they wanted? Or do we need another minute or two? Okay, I'm going to open one of these that's getting pasted and walk through someone's solution and make sure everyone gets a chance to see what's going on. I will provide a working solution at the end with a few comments, but it's not made yet, so I can't just paste it to you. So we've got, oh, the scrolling is being really weird. There we go. So I've got the code pulled up. Okay, your uncontrolled text is, and I'll say something. And if I backspace, things work the way I expect. Your controlled text is something. If I click clear it, then both the controlled text that I can see and the controlled text inside the input are properly cleared. And the reason that works is this right, oh, scrolling is being weird. Okay, this right here. If you tell your input exactly what value to show, it will always show that value. And if you carefully choose to show the value that you update over time, then your input will show exactly your updated value over time. And that's the key insight for controlled components. Before I move on, are there any final questions on controlled components? Cool. I'm thinking last time we really did not get very many breaks in, so let's take a 5-minute break. And when we come back, if there's some good questions in chat, I'll address them. If not, we'll move on. So I'll throw up another 5-minute timer. There it is. And I'll throw up a little message that says on break. Okay. We are back. There was a few questions in chat. I wrote up a short summary of controlled versus uncontrolled. Bruce linked what looks like a pretty good bottom line, or kind of a really good summary of what's going on. So check those out. And let's keep going to the second thing I want to cover tonight, which is the rules of set state. Now we've been using set state quite a bit already, but there's some details you should be aware of that fully understanding these details will help you avoid bugs, as well as the headache and frustration that comes from staring at your code thinking, why isn't it doing what I want it to do? So this is like fundamental information about how set state works so that we can make better use of set state and make better code. In this little section, you will see prev state that I think Venki was asking about earlier. We'll start seeing callbacks that set state gives to us to be able to use in certain circumstances. So I want to ask what, I think we've already asked what is set state, but what do you know about set state as far as like, what are the gotchas that you know about in set state? What are the problems that you are already aware of, or things that could already go wrong with set state? I think Eric brings up a really interesting point. Don't put set state in render. If you do that and you set state in render, then the result of set state is that React re-renders, which causes it to set state again and then re-render, and then again and again and again. Lorenzo said that remembering that set state is a function, whereas this dot state is an object, can be challenging. I think familiarity with React, as that increases, as you continue to use React for more than just a few days, you'll kind of sort that out. I think he brings up, I had problems with counter, where like incrementing a counter can get kind of weird. And that's actually what we're going to do right about now. Although I want to talk through a few things to be aware of with state. So set state is a function. It takes in an object, and this can be like a partial object, right? It doesn't have to be every key value pair that your state has. Remember, it can be just a subset of those, but it will still keep the old values and kind of merge everything together the way you expect it to. There's a few things to be aware of. I'll say partial object. React will take your new values from set state, and it'll merge them with the old values. So we've already made use of that, but it's good to keep in mind. Set state triggers a re-render, meaning React calls render for us. And perhaps this one, which I will show you what I'm talking about, set state, maybe it should have actually been called, I'm going to say should be called request set state. And that's because set state is asynchronous. And what that means is you call set state, the rest of your code continues executing because it doesn't block the browser or anything like that. And then eventually, sometime in the future, your state will be correct and updated the way you expected. But it is asynchronous, which means it might not happen right now. So set state, you can actually think of it as being called request set state, and that's a better way to think about it. So I'm going to pull up this. And I'll talk through the code we already have and where I'm headed with it. We have an app. It has a state with a counter initialized to 0. We have a to-do message for ourselves for handle increase. We are displaying this .state.counter, and we have a button that on click will call this method up here. Our button says that it should increase the counter by 1. In chat, Brandon said he noticed when he was console logging the to-do list object, as he added to-dos, the console.log was always one behind. In the next 5 to 10 minutes, I will show you why, and hopefully it'll help clear up a lot of confusion around set state. So let's implement handle increase to increase the counter by 1. How am I going to do that? Well, the easiest, most straightforward thing to do is use this .setState, which takes an object. I can put counter as a property on that object. And then I can do this .state.counter, the existing counter, plus 1. Save it, increase the counter by 1. I'm clicking, we go up. So I'm going to change the button to say increase the counter by 3. And instead of the easy solution, which you would think is just change that to from a 1 to a 3, I'm going to say, well, I've already written this code, and I know it works. So I'm going to copy it and just paste it 2 more times. That should do the same thing, right? Ami says this seems not very dry. Dry means don't repeat yourself. I agree. I'm making a point here. So who thinks this is going to do what we kind of think it'll do? So who thinks that if I click this button, it's going to go up to 3? Who thinks it's not? Type like 3 if you think it's going to go to 3 and some other number if not. No? Getting a lot of nots. And maybe that's because I'm making such a big deal about it. But maybe you don't quite know why. So I click, it only goes up by 1. Now I want to show you why. And this is why I made the big point about this dot set state is really more like this dot request set state. I shipped off this object to React land, and I said, hey, React, I would really love it if you set the counter to be this dot state dot counter plus 1. And I ship it off to React land and never hear back from it again. And then here, I say, hey, React, I've got another thing that I want you to do. So I ship off this request, and I say, hey, React, can you take counter and then take this dot state dot counter plus 1 and like change it? And I ship it off to React land and never hear back from it again. And then I do the same thing a third time. I ship off this request to React, and I say, hey, can you set counter to this dot state dot counter plus 1? Now, in between, that's like here where I'm putting the dashes and here, I shipped off that request. React did not necessarily finish it right here. It's going to finish it someday in the future, but it hasn't actually reconciled that state. So when on line 19, when I look up this dot state dot counter again, I've still got the same old value. In our case, it starts out to 0. I've still got this same old value that I'm pulling up from this dot state. And it's because React will get to it someday in the future, but it's not guaranteed to get there instantaneously. And that's what we mean by, it really could be called this dot request set state. That's what we mean by set state is asynchronous. And as just a point of interest, the reason React does this is that set state results in a re-render. And if we re-rendered here and potentially more times, and if we re-rendered every single time, that would be just a bunch of wasted computations. React tries to take a bunch of re-renders or a bunch of set states and batch them up into one change or one group of changes. That way it has to render fewer times. So Christopher suggests that you can only use one set state per handler. Now that'll actually work for you. That'll work just fine. Because if I comment these out, then by the time handle increase is finished executing and I've shipped off my one request, I can't possibly get another request in before React finishes rendering. So that'll actually work, but we're going to look at a different solution. So I'm going to say bad. I'm going to label this as bad. And I'm going to label this as good. Somebody hinted at it. Oh, I think Jorge has been reading ahead. You can kind of look up and see. I'm just actually going to paste his code in here. So he's got this funky syntax going on. I thought we had just agreed that this dot set state took an object. And here we're passing in a function. Like, what's going on? So this is not quite right. This dot set state does take a function, can take a function, and it will actually give you the previous state. And you are expected to return the state that you want to see. So this, if we look back to our object syntax where we pass an object to set state, we give it an object that has the keys and the values that we want. The function syntax, you return the object that has the keys and the values that you want changed. So we can have a counter, and instead of doing this .state.counter, which we've just shown can be out of date, we use this previous state here, and we do +1 like that. So first off, before we go crazy and add more, let's just see that this works. Whoops. You have to use the counter, not the whole object. Okay. This is working. But what makes it cool? Well, I just pasted 3 times. Again, not dry, but pasted the code 3 times. Now, if I increase the counter by 3, who thinks it's going to be 3 and who thinks it's not going to be 3? Betty is hedging his bets and says it could be 3, and I agree, it could be. So I'm going to click. It does, in fact, increase by 3. But here's why. Let me explain the way the React engine works through this. I'm the React interpreter. I come into this handle increase. I see this .set state. It has a function. And I'm like, oh, okay, so you want to change state. Well, I'll add it to the queue of things that I need to get to. And then I move on and I say, oh, okay, hey, you want to set state again. Well, you've given me a function, so I can do it later. And I add it to the queue of things that I want to work on. And then I get to this one and I say, oh, well, you want to change set state again. Okay, well, I'll add this function to the queue of things that I need to work on later. And then eventually React comes around and it actually executes our functions. So the way it does this is it takes kind of the original state, the state that happened that existed before we clicked this button, and then it passes it into this prev state. And then we return an object that represents the changes we want made to state. Then it takes the new state. So it just reconciled the old state that it passed in here with our changes that we requested right here. And since React is doing this in its own batch, it knows when it's done reconciling these changes. It takes the now newish state and passes it in right here. So there's like a little annotate tool. Perfect. So the old state, before we even click the button, goes in here. And then all of these changes get applied and get passed in as a new state right there. And then all of these changes get applied and it gets passed in as a new state right here. And then all of those changes get applied. And then React finally calls render because it's now done with its queue of stuff that we requested. So Mehdi asked, does it do this in sequence or at random? I believe I'm not 100% certain, but I believe that it does this in sequence, and it does it in like a queue type fashion. Like the first person, that's this one up here. This first one will happen first, and this second one will happen second, and so on. Michael asked, does it batch it all into one render like in the previous example? Yes. So the previous example up here, we shipped off these requested changes, and then we shipped off another batch of requested changes, and then we shipped off another batch of requested changes. React applied all of those changes, but because of the way we were requesting them, they're kind of wrong, and then it makes one render. This good way, we ship off a change request, another change request, another change request. React processes them all and then results in one render at the end. James is asking a great question. Why would we do this instead of just prev state.counter plus 3? You would not do what I'm doing right now, especially for a situation where you can just change it to be a plus 3. The reason I wanted to show this is that it's a pretty simple example, but it gets the point across that if you want to do multiple state changes, that you have to chain them in a very specific way using this function syntax. Luis says, how does it know it's the previous state? Well, React is the person who's ultimately calling. I'm going to clear this. React is ultimately what's calling this function. Let me make sure I outline just the right function. React is ultimately calling that. I'm not calling it. I'm defining the function, but I'm not calling it. So React calls this, and it passes in whatever it wants to pass in, but the React specification says it will pass in the most recent version of state with all of your previous changes reconciled. Bruce is asking, prev state is a keyword, and it's actually just an argument name. So we could name this one Bob. That's a good name. I'm going to name this one Dan because I have a friend named Dan. And this one's going to be named Russell. Those are just the argument names. However, prev state is the most common name that I've seen for it. So if you name yours Bob, your developer coworkers will seriously question how well you know React. Eric has a really great question. Is this new syntax the preferred way of doing most set states? I'm going to say, They're both really similar. I think the object syntax is slightly nicer to read. I think the function syntax is like a line and a half longer, and it's really not that much more complex to read. Dan Abramov is one of the developers on React, and he has some opinions on the matter. My opinion is that it doesn't really matter unless you really need to be using the function style. So what I want to do is show you why you might actually do this. So let me undo that and name them prev state, because okay, that makes me feel better. I'm going to comment these out. Still leave them because they are good. But now in handle increase, we have nothing running right now. So I'm going to show why you might actually use this. Okay. I'm going to say this dot set state takes in the prev state and returns a new object where the counter +1. So we're still increasing the same way we used to. But now I'm going to take the prev state and I'm going to say if prev state dot counter is greater than 10, return an object with counter set back to 0. Else return the prev state, no changes. Or actually I'm going to do return null, I think works as well. How about empty object? I'm just going to put a comment in here. So I kind of flip-flopped there, but no changes. All right, so let's go look at what I did. I'm going to say let's increase our counter the way we always have been. And then if we happen to be in the situation where the counter is too large, we're going to reset it back to 0. Now, this is kind of still a contrived example because counters are really, really simple. But if I click up to 10 and then one more, I'm down to 0. So what this let me do is have this core piece of functionality, like always increase by 1. And then this secondary, I only run it sometimes piece of functionality that it let me separate kind of two concepts into the same click handler. One is I should increase the counter, and the other is there's an upper limit to how big the counter can be. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of questions, so I'm just going to start hitting them at the top. Mitchell says, if you create a function for set state, it will always pass in the previous state. Yes. So let me write this explicitly. Set state has two ways to be used. One, pass in an object. Two, pass in a function. So we just learned about the function way. And React says, if you give me a function, I will eventually call that function and I will pass in a version of state. Michael says, so the previous state is basically just returning an ES6 arrow function with the return as a new state, and that's why it processes it differently. More accurately, prev state arrow bracket stuff, close bracket, is a complete function. So let me rewrite this without using ES6 notation. Set state is being given a function. The argument happens to be prev state, which I think also answered Venky's question. Do we have to use a callback function inside the set state method? No. You can use the object way we've been doing before, or you can use passing a function. Christopher asks, couldn't we just merge those two set statements? Yes. And it wouldn't be too terribly complex to merge both of them. But having the ability to separate concerns into multiple locations um, can enable some pretty good things down the road. Um, Benke says, I was asking about prev state and callback function. I don't think I'm quite understanding that question. But somebody else, Luis said, since you're using arrow functions, wouldn't it return by itself? The answer is if I pack everything onto one line, yes. But once you hit multi-line, then these curly braces stop being object and they start being the curly braces to mean a function. So I have to have an explicit return. But to clear things up, I could actually change this to a regular ES5 function as well. And everything works the way I'm expecting. Oh, okay. I think I get what Benke's asking. Can we use set state inside, or can we use prev state inside set state without a callback function? The answer to that is no. And that's because the only way prev state is being given to us is through an argument. And if we want to get an argument, we need to have a function. All right, I'll answer this last question, or keep talking, Kyle. Feel free. Christopher says, if the state contains more than one key value pair, do you have to name them all or just the ones you want to change? This is like before, you just have to name the ones you change. And that's why here I'm returning an empty object, which is synonymous with no changes. Okay, I'm going to get the last, or it's not the last, it's the next sandbox, code sandbox to you. Let me open it up and make sure it's the right one. Perfect. So we're starting out roughly where we did in lecture. We've got a counter here. I have a function called handle bad increase. And I want you to write code that looks like it would increase this dot state by dot counter by 3, but it actually only increases it by 1. You should call set state 3 times. So I want you to do the thing that you probably would have done before lecture today. I want you to write that code and look at it and realize that it's not going to work. Realize that that's actually a bad increase. But I do want you to write that code. And then I want you to write code in this one that actually increases the state dot counter by 3. Again, you should call set state 3 times. But I want you to see side by side and write side by side the difference between an increase that will not work, 3 set states that will not build on each other, and 3 set states that will build on top of each other. So I just pasted that. I'll give you 5 minutes. I think that has been working out pretty well. So work on this, and I will pull up the code that we wrote here. So bad and good. Okay, we are back. And it looks like a lot of people are able to finish, which is great. I'm going to grab the most recent one and check this out. So the goal was to write code that would not work, but that older, or rather younger, less wise versions of ourselves would think would work, which is exactly what this is. It looks like this should work, but it doesn't. It just increases by 1. And that's because we're referencing a stale version of state every time we send off this update request. Now, if I look at increase counter by 3, the one that should work for real, that works exactly the way we expect. And the reason is that it's using the function version of setState, which is giving us the freshest version of state every time we request an update to it. And that is pretty much setState in a nutshell. Paul is saying that the pre-state function has to return an object that returns an object. I think there's some confusion around this ES6 syntax. I'm going to transform this code visually, but not functionally. Ta-da! This is just a function. These curly braces are just the function boundaries. Now, I know what you're wondering about. You're like, well, but this arrow just returns the thing that's right there. And yes, if everything's packed onto one line, the arrow returns the stuff that's to the right of it. But if you split it onto multiple lines, it just becomes a regular function body, and you have to have an explicit return. So it is still just a function. This is just the body. This is just the return. So it's just a function that returns an object. Michael says, how could we set it to append the new number at the end? So we would see 14710. I'm going to set the counter to, and it be initialized to 1, because I think that's like starting out closer to where we want. Oh, so we would see 1 comma 4. Okay, I see what you mean. Yes. Okay, so what you mean is that it should say up here, it should have like multiple numbers that keep extending. Yeah, something like an array would be a better option for that. But I'm pretty satisfied that we understand set state. There's 2 different ways to use it. One with an object, one with a function that returns an object. Yeah, there's one tiny thing that I hadn't mentioned yet. You can do a set state callback. So not just passing in a function for the first parameter, but you can pass in a function in the second parameter that will call after set state is done. And you can actually pass that function into either So I'm going to say after bad set state is done and after good set state is done, save it, open the console, and I'm going to do the bad one. So it's like this extra parameter. It's not used a ton, but it's good to be aware that there is a built-in callback for set state. All right, let's move on. Last thing I want to go over in class is a little more complex than what we've been doing up till now, but it's nothing more than what we've been doing up till now. And I'll show you what I mean. So oh, do we need to take a break? Please? Okay, yep. Somebody wants to take a break. Let's do it. And there's no shame in that. Sometimes I forget when I take breaks and when I don't. So let's do a 5-minute break, refresh, recharge your brains. When we get back, I will explain what we're going to do. Okay, we are back. And before I start talking about the code that you see, I want to pull this onto the screen, maybe up the size a little. And I want to talk through this. This is going to be a series of questions. And since there's 6 question marks, I'll probably end up asking 6 questions. Let's imagine you are a React app, or you're designing a React app. It's going to have like a top level component, and that's going to have some components inside of it that you've written. Those are going to have some components inside of them that have been written, and so on and so forth, until finally it's the very end of your tree of components, and there's like the last level of components. And the question I want to ask is, does a top level parent component, the very first component, usually called app, does it have state? Answers are always, sometimes, never, yes, no, anything of that sort. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of mostly positive results of like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to have the top level component have state. So I'm going to say most of the time. Most of the time, you want your app to have some amount of state that can change over time. And a top level parent component can totally have state. That is both a functionally possible thing to do, as in you can write code that does that, as well as a common thing to do. Your top level parent almost always has state. Does your parent, very top level, have props coming into it? I'm seeing some mixed responses here. And so what I mean by this one is, does your app have props right here? Okay, a lot of mostly negative responses, and I'll try and clear up any reasons why people might have said yes. So we did do this. We did actually put props equals something last week. But that was because we were being really scrappy and we were just learning React. So we had to do some weird stuff to kind of get started learning React. So yes, you functionally could do this. It's possible to do it, but it usually doesn't make sense. So usually no, your most top level component does not have props coming in. I'll even change it to props coming in. And down there as well. Okay. So we've kind of solidified top level has props, or rather the top level has state most of the time, and that it does not usually have props coming in. That makes sense. The first level child component, so a direct descendant of the thing we just talked about, does that have its own state? So I'm seeing a lot of yeses, but what about Kyle's question from like 2 minutes ago? It's good to try to keep a single source of truth, right? Like why should the top level have state and then like this first level have different state? So that's kind of a hard question for me to ask because it's so nuanced as to whether or not a component, besides the top one, should or should not have state. You can program it to have state. You certainly can. You can make anything be a class component and have its own state. But what I'll say is maybe not. And that's because maybe you have a component that it should manage its own state. It doesn't need to have a parent tell it what the state is. It's kind of like a sub-component. It manages its own state. It has its own thing. That's not a bad thing. On the other hand, maybe it makes more sense for these middle layers to not have state, and it's totally fine as well. Michael brought up a good point. Wouldn't a very large app like Facebook be difficult to manage all the state in a top-level parent? Yes. So we've introduced state, and we said, look how cool state is. And all we've built with it is a to-do app so far. In the next few weeks, I think Dan will be back. You're going to be talking about like advanced React concepts, and you're going to be dealing with those bigger questions of like, well, what happens when I get beyond a 5-component app, a 10-component app? And you'll start dealing with state in different ways. Jesse says Redux, and that, I believe, is what you will be learning, yes. But you don't need to know about it now. So what about props? These first-level child components, do they have props coming in? Yes, they do. And that's because state flows down as props. And so if you have state somewhere, almost always that's going to be passed down to somebody else as props. Okay, so now some more levels down. We're really way down in the app. Should this last level of great grandchildren have state? I'm seeing a bunch of negative responses. Maybe, probably not, some no's. I'm going to say probably not. It's possible, but probably not. But will it have props coming in? Yeah. I'm going to say almost certainly. Kyle asked, can we go over the syntax of passing state from a parent to a child again? Yes. Real quick. Class app. I'm gonna dash here and change the language. Oh, set syntax to JavaScript. Okay, there we go. Okay, class app equals, or rather, class app extends React.component. Remember, now we have this constructor. It calls super, and then it has this dot state is an object with, I'm going to say foo as a string. I'm going to put that on one line just to keep this all together here. And then inside of render, I will return div and an end div. Ooh, my syntax is really messed up. And I'll have a child with this is a prop equal this dot state dot foo. So to answer Kyle's question, kind of What is the syntax? Well, you can pass anything to somebody else as a prop. I'm just happening to pass this .state.foo. Christopher says, is there an approximate limit to the number of component levels you want to have? Yeah. And that number is probably going to vary from person to person. But if you have maybe 3 to 5 layers, that's probably fine. More than that, and it gets kind of tedious, and I'll show you real quick what's going on. Or I'll show you why I say that it gets tedious. So back to our little discussion, and I have this some more levels down. Let me disable JavaScript. There we go. So what's happening at each of these levels? Well, we decided that the top level has state, and it passes it down, and then those get passed down, and then that gets passed down, and so on and so forth. And if you're somewhere in the middle, and all you're doing is taking in props and passing them down, and taking in props and passing them down, it can get really annoying to pipe props from like this component down 3 layers, just so that 3 layers down they have access to the right component. So 3 to 5 probably fine. More than that, you should probably rethink where you're holding the state for that component. Okay, so that was a pretty lengthy discussion, but hopefully it helps clear up who's responsible for holding state, what good are props, and how, again, does data flow through a React app, which is somebody holds state at the top, and it flows from props all the way through and down. I will paste this so that we don't lose my beautiful code. There you go. Read it if you want. Cancel, don't save. Okay. So now we can go one of 2 directions. This that I have pulled up right now is a little example that was put together by Ryan Hamblin. And he has a really awesome video in the training kit going through it. I could go through it with you with our remaining 15-ish minutes, or I can show how to kind of toggle state from a child component, which will probably help you with the To-Do app if you've gotten stuck on being able to click on that child component and toggle the status of that child. Okay. I was hoping that I sold Ryan's video well enough. I don't know if you're familiar with Ryan. He does a great job explaining a lot of things. Yeah, I will paste that video right now. Okay. It's in training kit. Class components 2 is the day. If any of my explanations didn't quite make sense, again, a lot of this content is really similar to what's going on here. So see Ryan's explanations if you want. And then it's the very last video down here. So I don't know if there's a way I can link directly to it, but it's down at the bottom of the page. So let's skip that and close, 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 close. All right, empty desktop. Mind is free. What I want to do is start from scratch and narrate you through me solving this problem. One of the PMs noted that some of you didn't feel like you knew really how to get started. So I'm just going to narrate me getting started and solving this. Hopefully that helps you get a better sense for the questions to ask yourself and the kind of internal monologue that you want to have as you're getting going on a project like this. The first thing I'm going to do is open up the project that I know I want to work on. And I think you will fork it, or you already have, but I'm just going to clone it. We're going to go into projects, Lambda school, and you probably want this text bigger, don't you? Git clone that. So now I'm going to go into that folder, and I'm just going to open up the README and start reading. Oh, okay, initializing the project, fork and clone, done, yarn install, and then yarn start. Okay, I'm going to start there. Yarn install, and we will sit and watch the things spin. Alrighty, and yarn start. Welcome to your to-do app. Alrighty. I'm going to open up a new tab here, and there's a shortcut to open up Visual Studio Code in the current folder. So I'm going to go code dot, and now I have a Visual Studio Code instance opened to this directory. Ooh, too big. All right, I'm just resizing windows to get something reasonable. How is font size on everything? Still readable? Good, great. Okay, so I'm going to ignore the README a little bit because I want to specifically get to me. Open preview, yeah. I'm gonna have to skip through a lot of this stuff because I don't have like an entire hour to go through solving this with you. But I will skip to this sort of thing, and it'll be kind of a reduced solution for it. Hopefully it still helps you though. So day 2 challenges, add the functionality to toggle your to-dos completed flag from false to true. Once a to-do is completed, be sure to demonstrate to the user that the to-do is completed by adding a line through style property if the completed flag is true. Okay. Well, I should actually keep that open. So what, like I can read the, I'm gonna call this a customer facing requirement. But I want to break this down to what does it mean for me, the developer? I have to be able to toggle the to-dos completed flag. Okay, so that means there's probably going to be a click handler involved. Now, there's a to-do inside of a to-do list. So that means a to-do list renders them. The to-do is like a child, but the to-do list knows whether or not, or rather, the to-do list is like holding the state, and the child is asking for something to be changed. So I have to like pass a click handler down. Beyond that, I need to be able to show this false or true stuff. So now I'm going to start opening up code and getting familiar with what's going on. App returns div with an h2, and the comments say this component is going to take care of state and any change handlers you need to work with your state. Okay, well, that seems pretty helpful. So I'm going to do constructor, or actually, I'll show you a different way. I can just put state straight on like that. Now you know. They are alternate syntaxes for the same thing, wherein we used to do constructor with this dot state inside. You can just set up state like this. All right, the to-dos, if I look back in the README, they look like this. Organize garage and bake cookies. Those are pretty solid to-dos. Okay. Now I want to render the to-do list. I'm going to check out components. Looks like I've already got one. Okay, but it doesn't do anything yet. All right, well, class to-do list extends React.component. Minor issue is that I don't have React in here, so import React from React. To-do list, and I'm just going to render it. It says, I am the to-do list. So you notice from kind of a higher level view, I'm not really doing anything except trying to get things rendering. I'm not trying to implement any functionality right now. I'm just trying to get stuff like imported and rendering and doing what I think it's doing, and then I'll add functionality later. So let's render that to-do list. Failed to compile. Export default was not found in to-do list. Well, that's really handy. It actually tells me what the solution is. I forgot to export default to-do list. So what that means is when this was trying to import something, there was nothing exported. So there was nothing to do. Jorge brings up, I thought the only class component would be the App.js. And the only stateful component should be App.js, so nobody else should have state. And does this say class component anywhere in here? I'm going to go ahead and write it like this, but notice that there is no state. I prefer the class syntax visually as opposed to having the two different syntaxes. So that's what I wrote. Okay, to-do list, and I'm the to-do list. We are officially rendering a to-do list. Okay, we need, from the perspective of the to-do list, we need two things. We need two things. One, the list. Two, a click handler to pass to children. So let's tackle one at a time. I want to do this dot props dot to-dos map each to-do into a to-do. Oh, James says, can I paste this into chat when I'm done? Yes. Don't feel like you need to keep up with my typing. In fact, I think it would be more beneficial for you to watch and listen rather than trying to keep up. I'm going to move pretty fast and just narrate how I'm approaching this problem. I will send off probably 3 or 4 of these files at the end of class. I might redact a couple of parts so that you get the challenge of implementing a couple of these really critical pieces, but it'll be almost complete, if not completely complete. Okay, so you'll notice I wrote notes to myself. We need 2 things. We need the list in props, and we need a click handler. Okay, cool, great. Then I came down here and I mapped that list to an individual to-do. And I'm going to say that handle click should be this .props handle click. You've noticed I've already picked the 2 names that I want to work with, to-dos and handle click. And you've also maybe noticed that in trying to accomplish these 2 things, I just created more work for myself. I need to get to-do figured out. Like, I don't have access to it right now. So if I save this, it fails to compile because to-do is not defined. Okay, well, import to-do from /to-do, which is going to crash because cannot read property map of undefined. To-dos doesn't exist. This prop coming in. So now I'll go back up to the app, who I know has to-dos. And I'm going to pass in this .state.todos. I'm just going to format this. I prefer to have my props listed vertically instead of running off the page horizontally. All right, so we decided there were 2 things. We needed to-dos and one other thing. Who remembers what that one other thing was? Yep. We need a click handle. So you'll notice as I'm going through this, I'm bouncing around between different files. And it seems like every line of code that I write makes more work for myself. That is normal. Eventually, all of this is going to wrap up and come together, and we'll have a working app. But for now, I need some kind of a click handler. I'm just going to console.log, or actually, I'm going to alert, so it's even easier. Handled. Okay, to-dos list, handle click, this at the end. Alrighty, to-do list pulls in a to-do. I'm going to go to definition on that, and there's nothing in to-do.js. So one more thing I got to do, class to-do extends react.component. I think if I save, React is not defined. I thought I could do automatic imports. That's a shame. But I'll import it. I'll extend. I will render, and I will return. I am a to-do. Oh, failed to compile because of, I forgot to export. Okay. So now we get to watch Russell debug live because I don't know what's going on right now. Okay. So check out this, this orange message down here. You will hear me say many times, don't be afraid to read error messages. They're actually usually great. Unless you're writing code in C, in which case error messages are not helpful. It's telling me that it's expected to return a value in an arrow function inside of to-do list. The only arrow function I have is inside this map, and I actually forgot to write return right there. Okay, now I'm getting this really great error telling me that I actually need a key. So if I remember right, to-do has a unique ID on it. Let's check. Yep, to-do has a unique ID. So I'm going to point this out well, perhaps not the last time. I'm going to point it out one more time. I have not written any useful functionality yet. I am still just rendering stuff in the right places. Like I am a to-do. It's not using the actual data yet. I don't have the click handler like doing anything. I didn't write any logic code here. I'm still just trying to get the framework set up. I think that's a great approach. Get the bare minimum of things kind of working, and then implement the functionality that you need. So now let's look at to-do list. Key is to do, handle click is passed in. Now let's pass in a to do that equals this whole to do. Now props should have a full-blown to do in here. So this dot props dot to do dot ID. That came through just fine, and then I'm going to have it display the task. Okay. Now I want to do on click with this dot props dot handle click. So you'll notice that alert came in handy, and now I'm able to see that the on click is working. Okay, I'm seeing some messages coming through. So why Jorge's asking why we need this there, but I'm not sure what this and there are. If you want to expand that. Oh, this dot props instead of props. This kind of goes back to what you were asking before, is why am I making this a class instead of just a function that takes props? I prefer the class looking style visually, and if you're using a class, then you have to use this dot props. Kurt is saying, or noticed that I didn't need a constructor, and that is true. And it's because I'm not using any state, so I don't have to make a constructor to like set up any state. The constructor is implicit, actually. A constructor that just calls super is the default constructor. That's what will always happen unless you override it. So I can omit it entirely, and everything works the way it should. Okay, let's get back on track with what we're trying to do. And you also find that you'll get 3 files deep into trying to accomplish something, and you'll have like 20 tabs open in Chrome, and sometimes you just forget what you're even trying to do. So where are we at? We have state at the very top level. It's got 2 to-dos. We know we can get the click handler running. And to-dos have a completed or not completed thing here. That's good. But then what? Well, let's go to a to-do. And I'm going to display is, I'm going to say this task is this dot props dot to do dot completed. It's going to look a little, is it complete, not completed? Completed. Huh. I was expecting to see either true or false over here, but let's see. How about I show you another cool thing you can do? I'm going to say const message equals this dot props dot to do dot completed. Ternary operator. If it's completed, true, then done. Otherwise, the message is not done. And then I can interpolate the message into here. Okay, organized garage is not done. Bake cookies is not done. Yeah, a couple people are suggesting this because it's a Boolean and not a string, and React doesn't apparently automatically convert those. But this is another thing that you can do. It helps keep your returns looking pretty clean. So I think this is actually a pretty good solution. Okay, so now we can tell if something is done or not done. Let's go back to this click handler. Who has some ideas of what we can do here? This is really the crux of why I spent the last 20 minutes talking at you. Who has some ideas of what we can do here? Okay, so we've got some good looking stuff here. Luis says we need to add a class to the div, making the P cross the text. So I'm in app. App doesn't need to add a class to a div. App doesn't care. App just stores a list of to-dos and renders a to-do list. It's to-do list's problem to figure out how to render it. Okay, let's look at to-do list. I don't think to-do list cares either. To-do list just takes a list of to-dos and renders them. To-do list doesn't care. Maybe to-do does. Aha, to-do cares about class. App doesn't care. So I'm not trying to bash on you for providing your ideas. What I'm trying to say is that each component in React has certain responsibilities. And at the level of app, I should not have to worry about the responsibility of adding a class to anything. I should only have to worry about changing the state here from false to true, or the other way around, true to false, depending on what's going on. So I think Christopher made a really good comment. He says, pass an argument identifying the clicked task. So he's suggesting that in here, we need to do something so that we can go toggle and change completed. Some other people are suggesting that we use it, and that is what we should do. So I'm going to do to-do ID. And let's right now just alert the to-do ID. And then we'll try to figure out what to do with the to-do ID. So we're in here. On click is this .props.handleClick, which is supposed to take an argument. Now what do we do? Because if I, oh, I'm thinking. If I do this props.todo.id and save it, the page just instantly alerts me that I clicked something, except I totally didn't click anything. And that's because onClick is supposed to be a reference to a function, and it's not supposed to actually call that function. Yeah, I think Christopher's already solved this. Chris is suggesting, or Christopher, I don't know if you ever shorten your name, is suggesting that we make a new anonymous function, just a nitty bitty little anonymous function here. And inside that function, we should call another function. So instead of doing this all in line, I'm gonna break this out. I'm gonna make a new function. Const my clicky handler. I'm gonna make a new function. I'm gonna make it ES6 style because then I can use this properly. And inside of that function, I will call this .props.handleClick with this .props.todo.id. Instead of instantly calling @handler, I'm going to call my new clicky handler. Or I'm not going to call it here. I'm going to pass that in as the click handler. I'm going to click through some alerts to refresh things. So now if I click on one of these, I'm going to drop a, have you ever seen a debugger statement? Kind of handy. I'm going to click on one of these, and you'll see that the debugger automatically stopped on my debugger statement. So I just clicked on this div. Now it's calling my clicky handler. And I'm going to call handleClick with the correct data, which eventually makes it all the way back up to app and it's the right thing. So now I have all of the pieces in place. I have the frame around what I want to accomplish. Now I'm going to go up into app. I actually have the to-do ID. It's the right value. Now I need to decide what to do with it. And we know ultimately we want to do this .set state. We know we want to change the to-dos, but like, what do we want to change them to? What I'll do is say, I want basically the same as the old to-dos, but I want a new list that contains all of the old to-dos with just a slight change. So I'm going to use map. I'm going to take in each to-do, and for each to-do, I will check if todo.id is the one I'm looking for, then I'm going to return a new object where the task is todo.task. That doesn't change. The ID is the old todo.id, and the completed is the opposite of the existing completed. On the other hand, so this is inside the if statement, if todo.id triple equals todo. If that's not the case, then I want to not change it at all. Okay. Luis says, wouldn't setting completed to true work since it will not call the whole list, but that specific to do? Wouldn't setting completed true since it will not call the whole list? Yeah, I think Jorge actually answers this. If I click a second time, it should toggle back to being not done. That's why I do this instead of manually just setting it to true. So if I click this, bake cookies is now done. Organizer's garage is done, but now it's not done. Not done. Done, done, not done, not done. So I went through a lot. It is now functionally working. Questions. Okay, Michael's asking, how do we add in CSS styles? So my first response to that is, whose responsibility? Which component's responsibility is it to think about CSS styles for a completed to-do? So in response to Michael, he's saying, is it to-do list's responsibility to add or subtract a class? I would say no. To-do list's responsibility is to render a list of to-dos. The end. And actually, it's already doing that perfectly well. To-do's responsibility is to render a to-do, and all the bells and whistles that go with that. And so some people are hinting at it, but it's going to be essentially like a class name here, a conditional class name, which you'll remember we did a few days ago. You'll have to go back and find some code to do it, but the to-do should be responsible for displaying a to-do. The to-do list responsible only for displaying a to-do list, and the app only responsible for passing the right state to the right people. Venki's asking, how do we implement this with functional components the exact same way? So let's do, I'm going to do a new file entirely. And I'm going to use the name foo. Let's see. Change the language mode to JavaScript. Okay. So functional component, const foo, you can tell it's a functional component because it's a function. And we're going to return div that says foo. Okay, the class component equivalent is to have a class foo which extends react.component with a render function, and then inside that render function, I'm just going to copy and paste this straight down because that's essentially all that render does. So to answer your question, and I want to avoid writing the entire assignment for you, but to answer your question, doing this with functional components would be a matter of changing this line to look more like a function. And instead of having this in a render body, you would just be using this as your function. I will paste this in chat. Okay. I hope this helps or helped. There's a lot of other pieces to this app, but the same approach can be used. Start simple. Start building kind of the whole framework of things that you need done, and then worry about the implementation details later. With everything that you need to implement, think about who is responsible for this and really try to limit where the responsibility is. Don't try to reach too far into or too far above. Just really think about who's the right person, who's the right component to be dealing with this stuff. Now that I've talked through all that, let me pull up the requirements for day 2. Add functionality to toggle your to-dos, complete a flag from false to true. Well, we pretty much already accomplished that, so you'll have to adapt it a bit, but you should be able to get something working now. Add the ability to remove any to-dos that you've completed. .filter will be your best friend here. I'm going to say that one more time. .filter will be your best friend here. When a user clicks on the clear completed, you should filter things out, anything that's been completed. And then you should style things to make it look awesome. There's some stretch problems as well. You can store your state into local storage. You can add some search functionality. And then you can even use a service called Netlify, which will let you host this app in the cloud. Definitely, this is a stretch. This is definitely a stretch goal. Getting things hosted can be really challenging, so don't worry if you're feeling like you're just not making any progress on that. Okay, I want to answer any final questions before I let you go. Unless there aren't any questions. Michael's asking about the sprint challenge. I have no idea what's in that. That would be a great thing for me to have looked at, but this is the last class that I'm lecturing and talking at you all for, so I actually didn't look beyond this. Glenn's asking, which manipulates and adds items to state? So I'm gonna answer that kind of building up to it. To-do's responsibility is to render a to-do. So I'm gonna say it's not there. To-do list responsibility is to render a list of to-dos. Not there. App's responsibility is to manage state. Aha, we have found it. App should ultimately manipulate and add items to state. Now, a tangent to your question might be, who should prepare the state to add? And we've got to-do form, which I didn't write here, but to-do form prepares a new to-do to be added to the state. So perhaps to-do form can do some of the work and pass it up to app, who then ultimately adds it to state. Benki, I will absolutely send these 3 files right after I stop recording and stuff. Glenn, to do form passes prepared package as a prop. I think you'll find looking at how handle click works to kind of pass a handler down to a child and get data back up in the parent, you'll find this pattern helpful with what you're trying to accomplish. Yeah, props are one way. Okay, let's call it there. Otherwise, I just feel like I could just keep talking all night. I love React. I hope you can learn to love React if you don't already. There is so much to learn. There's so much to do. You just got to keep chipping away at it. I know you can get there. There is so much, but a little bit every day and you will get better. So if Terry wants to stop recording, I think that's it.